Okay, so I'm back. I want to finish up this series that I was doing. It's been a huge break, a huge gap in between the videos that I did, previously, and then now this last one. But obviously been a little bit busy. I just want to get this out of the way, just to get this little series done. All the videos I pretty much said I was going to do. This will be the last one. This one's going to be on the nationalism, right? So I basically want to start this one by explaining, and this one's going to be kind of not as thought out maybe as the other ones were, because obviously I don't have the time. I don't really want to go too in depth into it. I just kind of want to just kind of chop it, kind of quick, like kind of get to the root of the problem, kind of chop off, you know, from there instead of trying to get into like your elaborations and all this other type of stuff, right? So I'm gonna get straight into the nationalism, basically to the first, part that I did through the explanation and the intro, through the breakdown of controlled opposition, right? Because if you break it down into the kind of what the categories are, then once you get to the categories, you can see that they're basically controlled opposition and what the issue is with that, right? So if you think about controlled opposition in general, right, one thing that you have to keep in mind is that a lot of people want to think of it in the simplistic terms, right? Because simplistically, you need three groups of people for controlled opposition. Simplistically, you need the power group, the group in power, the ruling class. I mean, right? And then you need the real opposition, and then obviously you need the controlled opposition. That's basic. That's obvious, right? But the issue with that is that if you try to do that practice in reality, I mean, what is most likely to happen is, I mean, without just the brutality and force of just eliminating the opposition, which is going to happen in pretty much every type scenario anyway, right? But you kind of want type more believable, more ideological control than just brute force being your only tactic, right? It's going to be your main tactic. It's going to be a continuous tactic, but it's not going to be the only tactic that you're going to use if you're going to be successful in any way. Um, I mean, long term, and obviously it takes a lot of pressure off if you don't have to engage in brute force all the time. If you could just get some ideological control, you could eliminate some of the brute force, and you could have people working on your behalf, right? So you're going to want like multiple, I mean, as much as you can get groups of people who can funnel, right? Because in that main thing, what's going to happen is you're going to have the real opposition is going to be able to gain more control as the authentic factor if you don't have other movements that could project upon each other and engage in this like reverse psychology where they can see themselves as the authentic movement, right? With the three-part group, with just the ruling class and another opposition, that fake opposition through identity with the ruling class is going to delegitimize itself and not really have anything to play off of other than the ruling class itself, which if it's opposed to the opposition, but it pretends to be opposed to the ruling class, like eventually that's going to start to break down, right? Because the opposition could just define them as, ruling class adjacent, and being that this is one group that doesn't really have anything else to point to. Once that happens, I mean, it just becomes, you know, two part again, and you have like a real opposition, and it's not really as controlled as you would like it. So that's why, obviously, if you look at my establishment, I already broke down the establishment, because even within the establishment, they break down, right? So even within the establishment, you have Democrats and you have Republicans in the United States, for example, right? So they could then obviously they have their more establishment elements, right? Like there's even establishment hierarchies within the Democratic Party, right? Because Bernie Sanders is still establishment, Trump is still establishment, but even they could play like an anti-establishment factor within the power establishment structures, right? That's how complicated and complex and deep it has to get for you to maintain that type of control, like where it's like full control, and it's more functional and more practical and gives you more flexibility in real life. It has to be that complex. So what the ruling class automatically understands, right, is that they're not going to get everybody to fall into even an establishment part, right? Not everybody are they going to be able to, within controlled opposition, to funnel back to the establishment at all. So in creating these other groups, sometimes you have to come up with different strategies and tactics that don't require the people to accept a ruling class identity of sorts, right? Like directly, right? Like, so you could have people totally opposed to the Democratic and Republican parties. Like, they're totally opposed to both parties, right? But they could still fall into a controlled opposition category and still work either in the interest of the ruling class directly or indirectly, or just not in an oppositional interest, right? So you have all those different levels of to filter people into, right? So you might, like, again, you could filter back to the establishment, but then you could have them, just in favor of helping the establishment, but not necessarily for them. Like, they could be more in practice for them, but not in principle, like vocally for them. Or you could have them basically be neutral, such that they don't work in favor of the opposition. So they might not work in favor of the establishment, but they don't work in favor of the opposition either. And that's important when looking at the nationalism, right? For two reasons. Because the main two groups of people that I want to talk about, specifically within the lines of the socialist aspects, and I mean, not socialist, but Pan-African aspects, are like the identity-based movement. Specifically in this sense, in this video, I want to talk about the, like, ADOS, the FBA, the lineage-based identity movements, Black American type movements, right? Against the Black nationalist type movements. Right? So what confusion happens here, and what the nature of the controlled opposition allows for, is both of these groups, because they're split, can gain from the other group a sense of legitimacy as being the authentic opposition. And each group could point at the other group as the controlled opposition. And even the ruling class can work the reverse psychological tactics. I mean, and it's the same ones they work for Democrats and Republicans, right? So they're so schooled in this, right? And I mean, it's like clockwork. They don't really have to even do much, right? They could just sit back and they'll do it. People will do it to themselves. But, you could have these tactics where you could use the reverse psychologies, right? So you could throw out, oh, well, this group does this, therefore this other group, just through opposition, say that's wrong, right? Or they could point to their followers and say, well, this group is obviously controlled opposition, therefore it just automatically assume that, well, we're not, like, we're exempt from it because this other group is, and we're opposed to them, right? Or this other group, just in general, because they're not us, then is the controlled opposition group, right? And this type of projection and this type of identification within these ideological structures, has a strong functioning. And obviously, especially has an even stronger functioning when people fall into the trap, instead of, stepping back and looking at it from, overall perspective of whether or not the group that they're actually a part of, whether or not they engage in that self-critique of the group that I might have some type of affiliation or identity with. What are the problems with that group? Should I actually have the identity at all? And insofar as I do have the identity, or should have it, where would be the best position to actually fall into, right? What's the best thought out and articulated version of that politics and of the ideology that I'm trying to espouse, what is the best for the results and best for the politics that I want to envision and impose upon the reality that I'm in, right? So if you go back to, I guess, when like the early 20th century, like the first black movements in the United States, political movements. I get, well, not maybe not the first. Maybe I guess you would say the first starting like towards the 20th century, right? Into the 20th century. So after, well, I guess at the beginning or not, yeah, the beginning of what we would have been the Jim Crow era, because obviously you had Reconstruction, or you had the Civil War and Reconstruction period that obviously broke down, and then you had just kind of this new era coming out into the 20th century, with the first major leader maybe of the period I'm talking about maybe being Booker T. Washington as far as black leadership. And then obviously you had people challenging Booker T. Washington, Du Bois, Monroe Trotter, Ida B. Wells, like these type of more radical groups. At least I guess in Trotter maybe it was a little bit more radical than maybe someone like Du Bois, but then you had these groups opposed, and then obviously you had growing socialist movements in the 20th century, right? So at the same time period, you had people in power thinking to themselves, well, given that Booker T. Washington was, sort of a guy who was at least somewhat, you could say, put into position by people in power. Obviously, he was receiving, philanthropy money from, these large industrial capitalists, Carnegie and other people like that, for the university. He was given, access in a certain sense to certain positions, and his hold started to break down a little bit. Okay. And you have to envision, obviously, in this void, obviously, especially once he passes away, well, what could replace that would be maybe more beneficial? Not to get away from it totally, right? Because even to this day, we have certain people who have a more, assimilationist. I don't know if you could say they directly mirror Booker T. Washington, but you have people who could fall into similar categories as far as being almost spokespeople for a particular type of conservative white view that kind of goes against the protests type of politics, against the demanding, rights type of politics, and goes for more of a accommodationist type politics where you kind of assimilate into the system, work hard, do this, and this, and then kind of try to, kind of get in where you fit in, or where you would be allowed to fit in, right? So, mainly within the Republican Party that exists today, right? So you don't totally get rid of it, but then obviously, what do you do with these other people? Now, the NAACP was a response to that, right? That was one answer to that, right? The NAACP allowed for a more liberal, conservative type of movement that could contain a person, like a young, well, not younger. I guess he was younger compared to how old how long his life was, but a younger version of Du Bois. I guess during that time period, you could contain a person like that within the NAACP. Sort of. You could contain them to a certain extent, right? It might not last very long. It might not be as effective as you like it, but you could keep him at least somewhat from becoming something that you might not want, right? You could keep him contained a little bit, right? And obviously, you could keep him contained other ways, such as cutting off his funding at universities and such, right? So, you have that, right? But then what about the people who were more militant, right? What about the people who might have been part of, what Hubert Harrison was. Or, what about the people who were like that, African blood brotherhood, the type of stuff that we saw like in the Harlem Renaissance era, where you had people who were openly socialists and communists, more militant, like maybe a younger, very early version like A. Philip Randolph and such. What do you do with those type of people, right, during this era? And what do you do with their impact on a larger black audience, right? Because for Du Bois, for example, you might say that the ruling class would say, well, we know his style, we know the style that we're going to utilize in NAACP. And obviously, Du Bois went back and criticized this later on. But we know that it's going to be, I guess, what I think what the term Du Bois used in one of his papers was like highbrow. It became like a more highbrow organization. Obviously, it was more an intellectual focused organization. Part of what Du Bois wanted to show was, the intelligence. But then obviously that creates a certain distancing from just like your average, everyday black person. So it doesn't necessarily have that grassroots connection. And if it lacks that grassroots, authentic connection, that's going to create a huge problem for this from a standpoint of a mass movement, right? Because if it doesn't appeal to the masses, it's not mass-like, then it's not going to be suitable for that anyway. So you don't really have to. I mean, that's less of a worry. But if you create something that's for like the working people, the everyday people, such as what communism tried to be for the everyday, for the worker, then you could run into a complication. So how do you deal with that now, right? And Malcolm X, I think, gives an answer in one of his criticisms of Nation Islam. I don't think he necessarily sees it. I mean, he does. He's starting to see it, obviously, as he challenges the Nation Islam. So I want to start there. So this is from one of Malcolm X speeches. I could probably blow this up a little bit bigger so we could see it on this screen. Okay. So it says, I'm a Muslim. Okay, you must understand that the black Muslim movement, although it claimed a religious movement based upon Islam, was never accepted to the Orthodox Muslim world, or was never acceptable to the Orthodox Muslim world. Although at the same time it attracted the most militant and the most dissatisfied of the black community into it, and by getting them into it and the movement itself not having a real action program, it compromised a number of persons who were extremely young, militant, who were by nature activists but couldn't participate in things. So the inactivity of the movement caused a great deal of dissatisfaction until it finally broke up. Now, and then obviously formed the division, and then people regrouped, right? The movements that he obviously formed a splinter movements, basically movements that basically eventually you could say became for like the Black Panther Party, right? So that's something that you could do, right? So if there's going to be a mass movement, right, you can create a mass movement that fills the category of, well, it might not be for the establishment. It might not, get people to, like sheepdog them or whatever, herd them back into the establishment, but it might create a long-standing faction of individuals who are in an opposition, but ultimately do nothing of real action program, I guess in Malcolm's terms, do nothing to really affect anything that was actually going to touch what those in power want to hold on to. Obviously, their power. It's never going to challenge the actual power structures. It is going to do things that remain neutral or remain just totally benign in a sense. And that's what happened with, for example, Marcus Garvey. Okay. It was the creation of a movement or a co-opting of a movement that ended up not really having a concrete political agenda that could be sustained and, and sustain and go into activity, right? And it was a getting rid of the one it could, right? I mean, because obviously you have to do that as well. You can't just create a dead end type of movement platform. You have to get rid of the one that does have, certain goals and actions to move upon, right? So that's exactly what happened with Marcus Garvey and the UNIA, right? He took over a set of movements that had particular principles, particular leanings, mainly communist and socialist leanings, with anti-capitalist principles, anti-capitalist goals, right? And he shifted it into one of black nationalism, which is what we want to talk about in this video. And like I said, I wanted to get it down to the nitty gritty just to be able to cut it off from the roots. And the root of it is black nationalism. The problem with it is that it doesn't have any type of program, right? It doesn't have anything actionable. Now, you can get in the abstraction and conversation of socialism, right? But the problem with socialism and the problem with people is the ability to be able to define it. Socialism does mean anti-capitalist. And in the sense that you're a true communist or socialist, destroying capitalism, destroying socialism, destroying capitalism and, socialism is the same thing, right? The anti-capitalism, right, is the same as socialism. So through being a socialist, and engaging in socialism, you're engaging in anti-capitalism and an opposition to the power structure by definition, because the political economic structure of power is capitalism, right? That's how the political and economic structure exists and is sustained and holds on to power, right? But what you could do with black nationalism is say, well, the American capitalist system for the American capitalist system, right? It's none of our business, but the Africans for the Africans, right? So this is for them, this system's for them, but then we can get this separatist mindset, right? And black nationalism usually has a separatist type of agenda as it's used in controlled opposition, right? Now, if you get into the Fanonian sense of when he discusses this, like minus the pitfalls, there could be a national consciousness that exists, particularly within the masses of people, which if it goes upon a natural kind of progression of ideas and is allowed to grow and evolve, will eventually strip away the naive early stage nationalism and develop an actionable program that becomes more universal in nature as it goes along, right? As Malcolm X did during his lifetime, for example, right? Because he started becoming more and more open to the idea of, his views of other towards the people, especially once he made, the trip, to Mecca, right? And started accepting Islam. Obviously, it was no longer, black Muslim. He became more universal, more accepting, and was starting to, grow and evolve his ideas, right? But what obviously in a controlled opposition position, you could filter people into this separatist mindset of, well, we need to do for self, and obviously the do for self comes from of that type of mindset in general. If you go back to Garvey, came from the Booker T. Washington mindset anyway, right? So basically, to get into what white people realized is that white people basically realized that, hey, the Booker T. Washington stuff of us directly putting a leader up to say, well, this is what white people want for black people, and this have a black person say it, but we're standing right here behind him and giving him this money, kind of obviously, might not work. But if we send another person through here that obviously doesn't have these like blatant connections, and who doesn't speak highly of white people, but speaks negatively, then we could sell the same ideas back to the people, right? Don't really challenge the system, but it becomes more believable, and it becomes more um, harder to see the connections, right? So if you have someone like Garvey come basically with the same Booker T. Washington principles, but who has this anti-whiteness about them, so they kind of can kind of give you the basically the legitimacy that's needed, right? That I mentioned earlier when I showed the first thing. You have to establish that legitimacy, right? You can't just have the basic opposition. You have to have the opposition that can establish the authenticity through opposition to the other parts, right? So yeah, I mean that's pretty much what you can get. So the split into NAACP versus the nationalists wings of Garvey's ability to say, "Hey, look at the NAACP," right? Which he, right, right, is exactly what he did. Hey, look at these NAACP, because that's what they set up, a controlled opposition. That's exactly how controlled opposition works. If you don't have the two, it starts to break down, as it broke down with Booker T. Washington. It started to break down with Booker T. Washington because he was just this one entity who was trying, who could too easily be identified with. That's a practical example of what I was just explaining, right? So, and that's what theories has to do. See how the theory just did that right there? When I laid out the theory reflected a practical point in reality where you could see an example of it happening in reality, right? So when they tried to set up this controlled opposition with Booker T. Washington and just being the three-sided one of the establishment, the controlled opposition force, and the real opposition, what happened was W.E. Du Bois, I.W. Wells, Trotter, all these other people set Booker T. Washington up as that establishment figure, lost the controlled aspect, formed this opposition, and the real authentic opposition started to take a hold, right? But what then the establishment structure realized was, well, we got to get this controlled opposition in play by setting up these factions of within the opposition movements, and then that's when you get the NAACP, and then that's when you get the Garveyite movement. And the importance of that is that's the same dichotomy that existed throughout when I discussed in other videos. That same dichotomy, the same split structure existed throughout throughout the 20th century after that, right? Because you had the same dichotomy in the civil rights movement between, the civil rights establishment, which you might say Martin Luther King was kind of co-opted within, and the separatist movements of those times, which you might say Malcolm X or someone like that was in, right? And then that continued post that, right, when you had after the deaths, when you had maybe say Stokely Carmichael and then Ralph Abernathy or somebody like that, for example, right? Right, the Jesse Jacksons moving forward, right, into these new eras and then the separatists, right? So yeah, I mean that's pretty much what it is. So I mean, I guess I could go through some other stuff, but that's pretty much the point that I wanted to make. So I could probably stop the video there, but I guess I'll get into a little bit more of an explanation. I guess here's the video. I'm not really gonna play that because I think I made enough sense reading it. But I guess if I go back to my first thing, I'm done with this. I guess if I go back to this. Okay. So, I mean, basically that type of, okay, through the black nationalism, right? When you have the separatist type movements, that's the problem with it. The problem is that it's not a threat unless it's a threat. So if you're not directly saying overthrow this system or implicitly saying it, right? It doesn't matter what type of language, right? Unless it's like implicit or just explicitly stated that you're trying to overthrow a particular system, um, you're not a threat. Okay, if you're saying just allow this system to stay established and then we establish our own, that's I mean again, that's not a threat, right? There's no threat to white supremacy unless you're a direct threat to it, right? And obviously, there's no threat unless you're in the majority. Obviously, in this country, if you play by those rules, if you play by the racist rules, which black nationalism again does, it just adopts that directly from white supremacy. I'm talking about the race thing, right? That white people are a group, black people are a group. Well, to use black as a part of the group that you're in, right? Black nationalism, you have to accept blackness as an actual thing, which it's not, right? And whiteness is not an actual thing. White can actually be broken down into separate nationalist categories or ethnic categories, or however you want to break it, lineage categories too, right? Because there's people who are English, there's people who are German. English and German fought a world war against each other. I mean, pretty much, right? And so if you have that type of opposition between these two groups, then how the heck are these two groups supposed to be the same in opposition to, right? Because if you think about it, I mean, all these groups weren't all there engaged in the same type of behavior and activity at the same time without opposition to each other. They had opposition to each other. And in certain instances, certain people weren't engaged in particular activities, which is pointed out sometimes. But I mean, sometimes they were complicit, and sometimes they integrated into the complicity, right? But then at the same time, sometimes there were other groups that were complicit, right? So there's a dichotomy between the black, white nationalists. I mean, this doesn't make any sense in and of itself. And I think that's where black nationalism took over Pan-Africanism, right? Where originally the whole point of Pan-Africanism was you had all of these different groups that were going to, through their differences, through their maybe come together through this forced collectivization of, enslavement, of colonialization, and oppose it, right? People who otherwise might not have similar interests become similar, right? See themselves as similar, see themselves as part of the same struggle, versus the black nationalism, which takes the inherent racism of the white supremacy and says, oh, well, the racial essentialism of, oh, well, no, these groups are the same. Then you have the problem of the groups not being the same. And you run into that issue, right? I mean, saying that the groups are the same puts you in a deficit already, because don't even have the ability to even recognize, inherent differences. You create even more conflict between the groups as we see today. Then obviously, you create the issue of where the like ADOS type movements come in, where you basically have a reaction to the reaction, and now they come back in and say, oh, well, after the years of this, sameness, we're going to kind of establish this identity for ourselves, right? This ADOS identity, this FBA identity, because of all this, sameness and flat blackness that got espoused over all these years, even though that was already a controlled opposition. So now you got this other controlled group that comes on the scene, and basically has its own establishment, conservative liberal frame on it, on reparations. I guess that would be their actionable movement, versus this other group, which pretty much doesn't have an actionable movement really at all. Right. And that's pretty much what it is. When the situation is what it is. Obviously people who are within that group aren't necessarily going to see it that way, but that's pretty much it. It pretty much is what it is. I mean, the only other aspect I guess you could throw in would be the blatant racism, which is the other key issue, right? Because there's the issue of the fact that for, I can't say the majority, but for a decent number of individuals who could, I guess, be identified as white, there is nothing, and some, even certain other ones, there's, I mean, pretty much all of them you could argue all of them don't have an interest with white supremacy, a benefit, because ultimately you could argue again that white supremacy is going to be the downfall of them all, totally the collapse of the society, the collapse of this society, right? And obviously, communism argues this for white people, right? If you want to argue that communist is like the arguments that communism is this white thing for white people or whatever, they at least argue that there's this other system different from the one we have now, which you could argue could be white supremacy, however you want to say it. I mean, I wouldn't, obviously, but you could make the argument that could have white supremacist elements within that as well. But they obviously see that the system the way it is now doesn't really even benefit them. But then obviously, if you're creating this issue where you're trying to separate yourselves from these groups of people, even put yourself in opposition to these groups of people, then you're lowering your numbers in opposition. So just like they could split up the socialists, even not from just within the black groups, but they could split, these same splits exist within the white groups. So if they split that up, then obviously they could split the black groups from the white groups now and create even more splintered, more opposition, fighting each other, and a more diversified divide and conquer strategy, right? That becomes the other issue. So those are the main issues with black nationalism. Now, the identity-based nationalism becomes apart mainly because of the black nationalism, like I said, because what you get is you get a straw man of what Pan-Africanism is. Pan-Africanism becomes either just a straight black nationalism, the Garveyite program, or some synthesis of the worst elements within the socialist program or scientific socialist Marxist program, and the worst elements within the black nationalist Garveyite program connected together in either maybe a less bad Black Panther Party versions, and bad like Stokely Carmichael or Kwame Ture, I guess Kwame Ture versions of this nationalism, right? So now those are the representatives of Pan-Africanism, which is just a generalized term that doesn't really necessarily describe anything significant. I mean, it's just a generalized term. It's like socialism. It's just a generalized term. Obviously, you could have your own strategies. The only thing that Pan-Africanism really, as a whole, is against is white supremacist hegemony, and is the only thing that it's necessarily for is unity of different black groups who have a sameness in opposition to these systems, right? And through their interaction with these systems, right? So, I mean, obviously with black nationalism, you get away with that because you're throwing in these other elements, particularly, like I said, the white racism and racist essentialism. So, I mean, that's pretty much it. I'm going to go over some of these other things that I just had. I mean, I'm not sure if I'm going to include it in the video. But obviously, for one of the examples of how the Pan-Africanism issue got confused, what came from the Yvette Carnell video, which I have here, which that obviously I want to edit that part out where I didn't have the volume turned down, but there we go. But yeah, anyway, so yeah, the Pan-Africanism is Dead video, which caused all the major controversy. If you actually watch the video, you could even argue that she's not actually even addressing actual Pan-Africanism, but specifically sections of Pan-Africanism, and particular elements of nationalism that, or particular, I guess, straw man framings of nationalism, right?
1930, in January 1939, motorists in how find ourselves, because if there is no self-definition, ladies and gentlemen, neither black nor African are conscious identity markers for Africans in Africa.
So there she's talking about identity, which is not even, the identity part obviously has nothing to do with Pan-Africanism. The African identity thing comes from the black nationalism and the other stuff that got thrown in that really has nothing to do at a base level with Pan-Africanism. It has to do with the nationalist, the Garveyite stuff that was thrown in, right?
One is countries that were colonized by Brits and everybody, mass incarceration. We can't compete with that with our background. First, see if I can find it. Of Africa, you know, these countries are very insular. It's not like Europe where you have all these trains, these super trains where you go. I get it. My question is, how can I help you? I don't want to be in your way. I don't want to be in your way. If I immigrate to any, pay them enough, and then when they started,
right. Oh, here's another example of a video of what I'm talking about, where the particular type of like the African type stuff that we just addressed, where that comes from. Where here's a conversation where they're talking about the actual name of using the term African versus and I guess the funny thing about this is you have obviously Kwame Ture is the one espousing this particular viewpoint here. I mean, obviously one of the individuals that we're dealing with, and obviously I could get into that real quick, because I mentioned the Nation of Islam through Malcolm. I mentioned obviously the Garveyite movement, which was before that. But what happened after that, obviously, was the Black Panther Party, and then obviously Kwame Ture type socialist type movements that had that black nationalist elements. And as Malcolm mentioned, one of the ways, obviously, that you could form this opposition is through a group that doesn't have the action program, right? Alternatively, another method that you can use, which you could be used even within the groups that have no actionable program, but have like kind of like the semblance of militancy, right? The group that says all this rah stuff that could attract the militancy, but then have no program. You could have the program, but the program could be designed to entrap people, right? And that's what the Black Panther Party in large part was, right? So you have a program that could attract militants, but then you could utilize that to criminalize the militancy within these type of movements, get them into these type of movements, paint these movements as negative, and then arrest, disrupt, undermine these particular movements, and then use that public perception to justify the activity against those movements, right? So the rest, the trials and all this other type of stuff, like we saw during that era with the Black Panther Party, right? So yeah, that's another tactic that you could use, right? So regardless of whether or not it has an actionable program or not, you could even create the actionable program, but then filter people into that movement and then utilize that movement to capture people, right? To capture them because that they have this militant attitude because they're associated with this militant expressing movement. And then once they're in the movement, now you've identified your targets. And then now that you have them in one place, you can start taking them out more strategically because you know where they're at, right? I mean, that's another type of strategy which was used like with the Black Panther Party, like I mentioned. But anyway, as far as the name stuff, it's just dumb. I mean, you can't get any more dumb. It's like the bottom of the barrel type stuff. Like you only have to ask yourself, like, really, basically one question: Do you know who you're talking about, and how much does the term confuse people, right? So, I mean, there's different elements. There's different ways that we know, like, what we're talking about when we say, like, Black Americans. Like, when we talk about ADOS, FBA, like, everybody knows who we're talking about. And really, the only argument you could get in is whether or not the term makes sense for describing those stupid people, or does it create more confusion. Really, I mean, you could make the argument that there's no need to, but I mean, I can't think of any context in which that argument ever makes sense. Differentiation is a key aspect of almost everything, right? Of science generally, right? You have to differentiate one thing from the other. I mean, that's like, I mean, in daily life, but specifically in science, right? So scientifically, you have to differentiate groups of, objects even, right? Like if you can't tell the difference between a ball and a ground, you can't tell the difference between, the force that the ball has when you throw it against the ground and the opposite, when it bounces up in the air or whatever. Like, you just have to have these basic understandings of this is this and this is this, right? And obviously the differences and even the sameness, right? Because you got how something is different, how is it the same? The compare and the contrast. So I mean, obviously using a term like black creates complications, right? Because if you say black, it creates the complications of these other people who might fall into that category. If you say African, then obviously it creates even bigger confusion because there's groups of people who aren't meaningfully from Africa, unless you accept the racial essentialist framework of not that these particular people have a particular lineage or particular culture, but these particular groups have this type of essence about them that comes from this particular place that makes them that, right? It's like essentially, right? That can't be split off, not by their experiences, not by their knowledge, not by their treatment, not by their upbringing, not by anything else other than that's just where they came from, right? So, I mean, that becomes obviously a problem just because it was something that white racists just made up, because it doesn't even apply even to themselves, even because it doesn't even make sense, right? Because Africa is one of the most diverse places. Europe isn't even being way less diverse than Africa. Is so diverse that they don't even see themselves as the same. So they didn't even believe it with regard to themselves. Right? The only reason they came up with it in the first place was to make it easy to define who was going to be a slave and who wasn't. Right? So, I mean, like trying to make the sense of this, and I mean, I guess the thing about this specifically is that obviously we know that Kwame Ture was not, I guess, what we would define as the ADOS Black American. He was from one of the islands, like Trinidad or something like that. So it's absolutely insane hearing him talk about this. And I think one of the reasons, I guess this is one of the points where this makes more sense, is if you're trying to co-opt and take over another group of people's movement, you have to create an identity that puts you into sameness with them, right? Because otherwise they're going to look at you like, hey, like, you're not one of us. Like, so like, what are you doing, right? So, I mean, obviously, if you have to create these generalized frameworks to be able to identify it. And it, I guess, especially in different situations, right? Because if you create a more actionable program, then it might not matter, right? So if your goal was like the socialism, then it wouldn't matter if the person was white or black or Asian or whatever else. Like that wouldn't even come up in the conversation. Like as far as that being your goal, right? It'd be like a separate thing. But then bringing up this, African thing, obviously, in and of itself, of the specific, like the specifically, right? Specifically the African thing. You could see how there's this other alternative agenda, right? Because it doesn't even make sense, and we'll see like some of the arguments that's made.
Next tonight, we look at one of the most vigorous internal debates in the Black community in the past 2 decades. It's the issue of changing from Black to African American. It had only been 22 years since the turned
I'm just going to go ahead and
down to 4 other peoples one hour the term Black into popular usage. Leon Winter is a Black Power in 1966 when he was known as Stokely Carmichael that catapulted the term black into popular usage.
Right. That's another important thing to keep in mind, right? So he was the one that, and you have to keep this in mind too, that before that, like, I mean, besides the immigration issue, like people kind of knew what it was as far as like black, Americans and like just black struggles in general, and there being like a particular group of people, right? In the United States, right? And also like there was less of an issue. Again, this happened because of the massive immigration later on, right? Where like this became relevant, but obviously the post Jim Crow era, right, became relevant. So even the fact that happened during this time period is very telling. I guess just to say, because obviously when you could create the issue where you have a particular group that you need to keep in a particular position, particularly black Americans, where you need to keep them kind of down into a lower socioeconomic status, but at the same time you need a group of people to say to kind of defeat the idea that the United States is a racist nation. If you could use people who are not of that particular category, who are going to do anything to contradict your ideas, if put in position to do so, it's very easy to take people from outside who have a completely different experience, a completely different life framework, because it doesn't come from this type of essentialist mindset. It comes from the actual things that actually experiencing it, right? So if you're not experiencing U.S. style, racism historically, like you don't have that like historical memory that gets passed down from your family, from your everyday experience, from your everyday interaction, through your everyday culture, through everything that you go through on a daily basis of talk with your friends and things that people just know because it's your reality. If you immigrate here and you have a completely different upbringing, a completely different experience, a completely different objective and goal being passed on from your parents and your background and all this other stuff, and then you get thrust in these positions, and that's why we have this issue all the time with these celebrities. And then you find out, oh, this person's family was from Jamaica, this person's family was from Haiti, this person's family was from Trinidad, this person's family was from here and there, and then you throw them into these situations, and they're asked to talk about black issues, and then they speak down on this and this and this, or they defend racism, or they defend like black stereotypes and stuff like that of black Americans, or don't work hard, or they don't do this, they don't do that, complain, whatever else, right? You have these type of issues because of this, right? And you'd rather have those people who don't have that background if you're from white supremacy, but then you could use these people again to say, oh, well, hey, this doesn't exist. We could use this to say, hey, look at these Nigerians are doing perfectly fine in America. We can't see why these black people are having all these issues, right? It's obviously not racism, because then obviously this group's the same.
Leon Winter is a copy editor for the Wall Street Journal, and
seem to imply from your comment that capitalism is utterly inconsistent with Africa and Africans.
It is.
But I would posit that that's not true. If you look again at the nations of Africa, if you look at African people in every country of the world, especially in recent times, they essentially want things. They want products. They want the things that it's a wide pan.
Frog. All for African American people. Many people felt that it was beautiful. I mean, there was the people.
Human progress does not stand still. It moves. We came here as Africans. One of the first organizations we had fighting for us is known as the Free African Society. The very first independent organization we had in this country was the church. It was known as the African Methodist Episcopalian Church. So from Africans, our oppressor has changed us to colored, to Negro, to this, to that. We understand it's a step.
I mean, which obviously is completely different than how, when I showed Du Bois explain it historically. So you have to ask yourself, well, does he actually historically know about these issues, or did he just kind of pick it up and then obviously he's saying it now, right? Did he actually study these things historically? Is he a historian writing on these type of things, or did he just kind of make it up as he went along and looked up and saw, oh yeah, there's this group called these African, and didn't kind of pay attention to why or the context of it? Because yeah, obviously there was these groups because, for one, none of the freaking white people wanted them part of their groups, right? So you couldn't just have the Episcopal, the AME church, the Methodist Episcopal, because they didn't want them a part of it. So they had to have the African. And obviously, if the people are one generation away from African, of course they consider themselves African, just like every single other group of freaking immigrants consider themselves that when they first come here, right? It takes them at least a generation, 2 generations, 3 generations before they start saying, oh, well, I'm just this American or whatever, right? Of course they're going to identify with that, right? And when the change happened after the Civil War, when the slave trade ended, so there was no longer new people coming straight from Africa, which obviously African in and of itself is kind of stripping away the historical context and the identity and culture of the people from the African continent at first place, right? And then you bring them to the United States. Just the generalized term African is already indicative of that initial stripping away of any type of like particular tribal culture, or a national culture. And then obviously, in addition to that, now you have the issue of once you strip that away, you build this new group over generations. And then obviously over generations, and it's particularly after the Civil War, you had people who did identify as, I mean, it wasn't just the oppressor came down and say, hey, like you could identify as American now. It was people actually wanting to identify as American now. And even before that, I mean, if you look at the era like of abolitionists, right? They were already doing this. So I mean, it's like I don't know. He gave the response like for one, I mean, particularly he's talking about American U.S. history here, but then he's talking about us like it was everybody, like it was everybody in that diaspora. But then he's also talking about us maybe in the sense like that he's included within the American part, which he's not.
Coming to black had a powerful point, because the point was that we were oppressed because of this color of our skin, and this was racism. But this fight is not just a fight over the color of the skin. A fight for power is a fight for land. When Mr. Llewellyn speaks about power, he's talking about land. Our land is Africa. America is not our land. It belongs to the American Indians, and we have a right to stand and take a moral struggle with them. And we don't worry about people being for things. People want things is incorrect. The point is not to explain the world. The point is to change.
Well, the problem with the land thing is, for one, who gives what group an inherent right to what land, and also what Native Americans. So, if we have 100% population occupying the land right now, and Native Americans make up, okay, let's look it up. 2% right here. You're probably not gonna be able to see it on there, but I could blow it up. According, I think this is 2023, but according to the Census Bureau, the total population is about 6.79 million, which is probably less than when white people originally came here in the first place. I mean, probably less. I think that's definitely less. About 2%. So we're occupied obviously now by 100% of the population by definition of white people and everybody else. So 2% of the people here have a right to all the land that's here, but obviously aren't occupying all the land. Or I mean technically couldn't occupy it. So all the other groups are just supposed to leave. Even the ones that came here involuntarily are just supposed to leave. And their land is in Africa, even though they've never been there, or might not want to go there, or don't currently live there, or might be, and this is another complication, might actually have Native American lineage and ancestors, right? Which is a lot of people, right? Even when I showed the thing of how Du Bois described it. And this is a big deal. There in the United States, a tenth of the nation, okay, they are descendant of Africans brought to America during the 16th, 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries and reduced to slave labor. This group has no complete biological unity. White to black comprises of a different variety of physical characteristics, and often European Americans as well as African and American Indians, right? So Du Bois felt it and felt it was so important in 1940 when he writes the introduction to Appeal to the World for a particular violation against a particular group of people to the UN, right? When he writes this appeal in the introduction, he feels that it's enough that for him to put the American Indian category within the lineage description of Black Americans, right? And obviously white too, but I mean that's more obvious to a lot more people. But American Indian, he put it in there, right? So you're dealing with a group of people whose descendant, specifically also of Native Americans, who have been on this land for hundreds of years, along with the Native Americans. Obviously, that's how they become descended from in the first place, because interacting and having, families, right? And then you're saying, oh, well, they only have right to land in Africa arbitrarily, but no right to the land that they actually live on now. Okay. Based on, we don't know. Based on his ideological view that he's trying to push for particular interests.
If the people want material things, then we have a responsibility to tell them that things more important than material things, like freedom.
Mr. Winter?
Well, I can't claim to have been there, indeed, when black was coined, because I was somewhat in high school and I was on the listening end as, indeed, you were doing the talking. But it's always been my feeling that black was more than the recognition of where our blood comes from. It has a lot to do with the experience of people of color in a larger sense under colonialism, whether it was external colonialism, let's say in the Caribbean, or the internal colonialism that we had to deal with here in the United States, rather than simply a statement of Africa. Because the fact is, we have become more than simply descendants of Africa. We have created a lot of what America is in our own image. When you talk about this cultural-based offensive, I would rather see us claim American culture, which is not European culture. America does not mean white. American doesn't mean white. It means a combination of European and African and Asian and the rest of the cultures of the whole world. This is what America is. And if it denies the fact of what is African within it, then it is up to us to continue to assert that no, America does not mean white. America means a melting and a combination of things.
I think that's the point.
Getting
together to ancient now.
Container is called. It's what's the content of the container. This won't get us into the 21st century unless our kids can read, write, compute, and be able to compete in this country to make a living and to make progress. If that doesn't take place, we can put African American on them, we can put Negro on them, we can put anything you want to put on them, but they're not going to play the game in the 21st century because the field is getting tougher and tougher, and this not a level field.
Bruce says you know.
Wait, just a minute. Let me just we're about to run out of time. Mr. Toure, a final comment on that point.
The error of the thinking here is that most people think that Africans in America came here just like other immigrant groups did. All other immigrants came to America expecting a better way of life. We started in hell, which was a slave ship. And
he said we. But he didn't differentiate. He didn't differentiate between what we mean by America, because obviously America has two different separate meanings. The chauvinistic American or U.S. American. When U.S. people say American, they mean the U.S. Certain other people, when they say American, they mean the whole, not even just the North American continent, but the whole landmass, North America and South America. But he didn't differentiate what he meant. The islands, he didn't say, he just said America. So does he mean the U.S.? Because obviously that wouldn't include him.
and we're still in hell. Because this incorrect assumption makes it appear as if we've made a contribution with our culture. Our culture has been trampled upon, not the others. Any contribution we've made to...
And again, that's in blatant contradiction to any historical. So, I mean, I don't know what's the basis of that historical analysis? Because obviously that would not have been the way Du Bois, when he was writing, hundreds or whatever of articles and books and everything else that he was writing, would have described black people's cultural. That's not a way any of the people who were influenced by Souls of Black Folk who read it during the early 20th century movements would have thought about black people's contributions to America. So, I mean, I don't where he's pulling this out of. I don't know.
America is the test of the strength of our culture in spite of this oppression. We are Africans, and that's exactly where we're going.
Is the term, in your view, is that where you end it? Is that where it stops?
The content was African. The label has been changed to confuse us. If we came here as Africans, how do we end up as Americans? How do we...
Again, that doesn't make any sense in two completely different contexts. One, we didn't come here. We were born here. So we didn't come here. I was born here, right? So we didn't come here, right? So the group of people who come here is already not us. You have to say our ancestors, right? But even assuming that, different groups of people are in different places, right? And have different historical contexts and upbringing, right? Which is passed on in bulk, right? Because people always want to mention, oh, well, there might have been this one person who happened to have been, brought to the Caribbean first and then the United States. But then, this other person who might have been an ancestor of that person might have got shipped, to the Caribbean. And then obviously at one point in time they were in the U.S. and then they went somewhere else, or one time they were somewhere else and they came back to the U.S. But in totality of it, there are particular groups of people, large groups, entire lineages that exist that would describe themselves as American, right? And they know exactly what they mean when they say FBA, ADUS, or whatever else they want to call it, right? But I mean, as far as not being confused about what he means when he says we were African, no, we're confused about what we, and we're definitely confused about Africa. We didn't come from Africa. We were born here. So he's talking about these groups of people, right? So obviously, if you're talking about two completely different groups of people, you can't create sameness between those two completely different groups of people. So one hand, us now today, and the other hand, the groups of people who were actually brought, because it's kind of offensive to the people who actually were kidnapped from Africa and trafficked to the United States to say that same group is then, and not in the metaphorical sense, I guess it'd be okay, but in this explicit sense to say, I guess the same group of people, it's not. There was the descendants who were born in America. The descendants were born in America, and they were descendants of people who were born in America. And they were descendants of people who were born in America to people who were born in America. And it's just so on and so on.
Well, I would beg to differ you that my ancestors came here in a slave boat. They didn't. They came from the island of Jamaica, and they came on their own because they thought it was a better place to be than Jamaica.
They came to Jamaica. They came as slaves to Jamaica. I was born in Trinidad. That's where the slave ship dropped them.
You've now mixed up Jamaica.
See, he's Jamaican. Who a couple of seconds ago was making the argument about sort of the bootstrap argument. Black people need to know how to do this and need to do that. They're going to be left behind because they need to learn all these skills and all this other stuff to compete in capitalism and stuff.
Slaves. Right. We're all slaves.
We can't solve this one.
Jamaica. Who did you decide to drop in Jamaica? The white man dropped you in Jamaica and brought you to Mississippi. Right. So you don't define yourself by the enemy?
No, I define myself as the fighting places where I'm at, not where I used to be or where I thought I was.
So if you were fighting on a slave ship. So if you're fighting on a slave ship, we fought on the slave ships. We fought on the slave ships. Did you call yourself a warder?
And you're still fighting.
What? So okay. So if you're fighting on a slave ship, you would be a captured person fighting to free yourself from captivity by the nature of the definitions of what's going on in a situation. But obviously, by nature of your identity at that point is different. Well, the nature of your identity of what you're fighting for as at that percent would be a captive who is fighting to free themselves. Your nature as identity of lineage identity doesn't come into play there. The identity of coming to the United States and establishing an identity of the slavery defining the identity, which that was explained in the previous videos about how slavery defined identity as such, so and throughout history, right? Once that defines your identity, and that is what you're opposed to and fighting against, the white supremacy, it serves the purpose of defining the identity, then that becomes the identity which you're using to fight against whatever system, right? Through a Pan-Africanist view, right? This imposing of this African identity onto this identity that wasn't born out of Africanness, but as Africanness as a definition of who is allowed to be enslaved, right, is different, right? So he's confusing completely different things, right?
In 1989, right here in New York City.
Until Africa is free, we won't be free.
All right, one final practical note. Mr. Winter, you're the only...
Right. So, I mean, that's that. That's that. And this is the one about the coon thing. I don't know if I actually... I probably...
Just give me a second.
I'll just give it one more. It was this thing, and I'm just going to read it. Where it says, historically... Oh, wait. First, okay. There was a strain of thought. There's two. I think this is the one that says there were two strains of thought. Okay, there it goes. Two. Yeah, there. Okay, two strains of thought within. Yeah. One for the racial integrationist strain. And then this says from Frederick Douglass. And there's a defenestrated thought encompasses all nationality. Right. So the nationalist strain and the integrationist strain, right? Issue with this, the obvious issue with this, is first of all the FBA ADOS movement. The difference between those movements aren't necessarily nationalist versus integrationist. The difference between those movements have to do with like more like expansionist versus protectionist, right? So that's a little bit different, because those are two types of nationalism, right? One's a nationalism that's more exclusive to a particular lineage group, and one's an expansive one that tries to bring in, more people. So it'd be the difference, like the same type of difference between like like, and that even kind of works different too, right? But it would be a similar type difference from like exclusionary, like white nationalism versus one that is more like an American nationalism where we're bringing everybody, right? So but then obviously there's a difference between, because like ADOS might not view like these other groups of people as not American. They're only doing that with regard to other black people, whereas white people are doing that with regard to black people specifically, right? So that would be that difference, right? And then obviously like ADOS doesn't necessarily reject all the other groups of black people. They just reject it from the standpoint of existing within this particular lineage. And obviously, there are people within the ADOS movement who do represent a assimilationist. I don't use the term immigration, but a more assimilationist framework. I mean, that obviously, is a definite factor. However, the problem with that is that those aren't the two groups. The two groups weren't the integrationists versus separatists or nationalists, right? Those are the two controlled opposition groups. Well, if there's those in power and there's the two controlled opposition groups, and it leaves the other group, which is the actual genuine opposition, which is not nationalist and not integrationist. So that's kind of leaving that part out.
So it says here, the discussions around lineage.
Be on here with that dude, bro. I just can't do it, bro. I ain't.
All right, so you brought up lineage. What is the lineage? Who have zero connection to Tariq Nasheed's hashtag lineage movement? The discussions around lineage need to be extended to the lineage of ideas. There have always been two strains of thought within Black political consciousness.
Wrong. There haven't been two. Wrong.
And most of the ideas coming from the fecal-brained American movement originate with American integrationism.
Also wrong. Because okay, if we're talking about the lineage of ideas, then you could say that ADOS is even more could be even more similar to the Nation of Islam than it would be similar to the mainstream civil rights movement. I mean, in FBA, you could say that those are more similar to the Nation of Islam, especially FBA. You could say that there's a lot more people in there who are more militant, who are in a framework that might not necessarily have a political agenda, right? Because reparations is about as bland and non-political as the weak separatism of, oh, well, we need to have this land or we need to go back to whatever, right? I mean, it's just as bland, it's just as dead-endish, because just as much as you're not going to be able to settle back in Africa, just as much as white people aren't going to give you like the entire section of the American South and just say, oh, here, just go live on that land, you could have it. As much as that's not going to happen, reparations is probably not going to happen. Like if you want to make the argument that that's not going to happen, like either one of those are kind of just equally the same. Like there's a sameness there. So, and also the like there is an identity, just like black Muslims had an identity framed around a particular idea of their identity as Black people in the United States. And they were separatists, right? They weren't integrationists, right? So there actually is that ideological strain and lineage connected, right, through that, right? And as Malcolm mentioned in that same interview that I just showed, there was no pro-African elements of the Nation of Islam, for example. But again, it was a separatist identity-based movement. So the difference, as I just mentioned, between those different types of movements, ADOS and other ones, is how they deal with the issue of inclusion within the group as nationality, right? So they're both nationalist groups. And like I said, it's not that no one accepts like an integrationist framework of ideas in terms of like how they view that particular specifics of the issue, right? But that's a very simplistic way to look at it. So within that very particular simplicity of how do you deal with the issue of either separatism versus non-separatism or assimilation, yeah, they might answer more toward a simulationist, but that's not the case in every single instance, right? Because that really has no connection. Like you could consider yourself that as a lineage, but then that have no connection whatsoever to your beliefs as far as what you think on that question, right? So just because Yvette Carnell might have an assimilationist framework or even Antonio Moore, it doesn't matter. Even if I'm not saying that they actually do. I'm just saying even if they did, or Tariq Nasheed, even if they did have that view, doesn't mean that every single person who falls within a lineage category has to have that, right? So that's even wrong, even from that perspective. But in general, like from an ideological perspective, as far as the similarity between the ideas, even the ADOS could be even more considered similar to the Nation of Islam than it could be considered in a sense, to maybe even a mainstream civil rights movement, depending on what particular people you're talking about, right? Because there were elements of the mainstream political movement that were very anti, for example, Martin Luther King, and Ada Philip Randolph and stuff like that, who might have been a lot more maybe anti-war, even maybe even more pro, even if it would have been more towards a bourgeois socialist framework, more pro even bourgeois socialism, where there's a lot of the elements of the ADOS that reject that type of bourgeois socialism, right? Even rejected Bernie Sanders during the second election, 2020. So yeah, there's that issue, right? So it doesn't even follow from that perspective, right?
So
y'all at with it. Go ahead.
And same thing with the NAACP being more socialist. They were the ADOS weren't the socialist. They were more even you could describe them as conservative. So those things don't even line up.
Y'all at with it. I'm entertaining for another 30 minutes. Then I gotta go, bro.
So check this out. Harold Cruz, The Crisis of the Negro Intellectual. He talks about the rejected strain of black political thought. And I'm not going to read the entire thing. He basically says, to sum it up, within Black America, there are two streams of thought. One is the historically stream of resistance, and the other is the stream of non-resistance. The resistance stream is known as our nationalism stream, and
again, that's wrong, because not only were there not two, the resistance strain was not nationalist. Like, or what's the resistance strain? So if your main issue that you're dealing with, okay, if the main issue you're dealing with in your daily life is slavery and being a slave, or being the ability to be captured and put back into slavery, kidnapped and put back into slavery, or treated as, a slave based on your identity, if that's the main thing you're dealing with in your life, how is opposition to that not a resistance? If the main thing you're dealing with in your life is Jim Crow, how is opposition to that not resistance? Right? So if you end slavery, if you end Jim Crow, right, which are big deals, it's a big deal. Even if it continued in a different, reinterpretation, it had to, because it had to adjust to your fighting resistance. Right? So they had to adjust to the resistance. So if they had to adjust to the resistance and if they had to create a controlled opposition in the first place, then there was obviously an opposition. There's opposition that they had to control. It was a resistance. Now, in that sense, nationalism, as I described earlier, wasn't a resistance. It was a controlled opposition. So that's wrong it was multifaceted and wrong on every facet.
The non-resistance is known as our civil rights stream. So it says here, the second paragraph, he says, historically,
the movement that ended a main pillar of white supremacy is non-resistant.
This rejected strain, as Theodore Draper described it, emerged simultaneously with its opposite, the racial integration strain. Although the word integration was not then in the Negro vocabulary as a synonym for civil rights or freedom, the prototype leader of the latter strain was Frederick Douglass, the great Negro abolitionist, and there is almost a direct line of development from him to the NAACP and modern civil rights movement.
No, there's not. There's not a direct line of development. No, there's definitely not a direct line of development. Yeah, but there's definitely not a direct line of development. The socialism alone, again, kills that angle off, because the NAACP was socialist, even in a sense, even it was like way more liberal and conservative. It even in a little sense was socialist. And then obviously, the same thing with the mainstream civil rights movement, the backdrop was socialist as well, even if it was bourgeois socialist the same way, right? So they had a lot more oppositional elements. Frederick Douglass was kind of pre-socialist in the sense that he didn't really even see like that. He didn't have like the Marxian lens and see the issues that would have came about. So he was more one of the free labor type of Republican type deals, right? So he didn't even have that concept yet. So that obviously plays a big part in that. Obviously, as well, the integration didn't exist as a synonym to civil rights because it never was. It was a euphemism for assimilation and accepting of the American style across the board, which obviously people in the civil rights movement didn't do. They didn't accept Jim Crow. They didn't accept Martin Luther King specifically didn't accept American capitalism as is. He didn't accept American imperialism as is. So that's definitely not assimilationist. It's definitely not integrationist in any sense. And the word integration was never, like I said, it never was a synonym for the civil rights and freedom. And obviously, they never used that word in that context when they were fighting for civil and political rights. They never used that word in that context. The word didn't come in that context until they opposed Du Bois, until the NAACP opposed Du Bois's view on segregation specifically, where he thought that a little bit of segregation was okay if it wasn't at the expense of, fighting specifically for the rights, in particular for the strengthening of Black institutions in and of themselves.
Let me take this off the screen. Why did I bring that up? When I'm saying that Yvette Carnell and these folks are throwing up the white flag, if you understand historically what the assimilationist movement was about, it was about being Americanized. It was about rejecting anything that had to do with Africa for the hopes of being made American. And
no, it wasn't. The primary reason why it came about in the first place was controlled opposition, because otherwise they would have had to deal with Du Bois. That's the reason why the NAACP or face value, they had to deal with Du Bois at face value, which they didn't want to do. So they need to have, or even Martin Luther King at face value. They didn't have to deal with any of these people at face value because they're able to deal with this other straw man framework of integration and assimilationism. And they were able to throw it, like the reason why I call it a euphemism, because they were able to throw it within this structural framework of saying that we're going to be granting these particular, when that never was going to be the case anyway. Like they never were going to give Black people in general specific rights, privileges, or any type of equal rights or political or civil rights or economic development or any of that stuff. But what they didn't want to happen was a widespread demand for that. So what you could split people up into is groups of people who think that that's even a possibility, and groups of people who don't see it as a possibility, but who don't otherwise have an alternative means of fighting for it, or even interest in fighting within that particular realm, right? So one group becomes this non-political entity with no action program within the system, and another group of people become a part of the system and make concessions to the system in return for nothing, ultimately. So this person becomes a part of the establishment and makes concessions to the system. This becomes an integrationist wing. And then you have people who aren't really involved in the system at all and don't have any type of real meaningful opposition to the system because they're sort of separated and outside of it. And then you have this group of people who actually want to genuinely challenge the system and change it and forcefully deal with it head on, who are sort of like ostracized and left out of both of these this dichotomous binary that was created as controlled opposition. You got the legitimate opposition who was opposed to the system, but at the same time didn't want to completely separate from the system, but deal with it like head on and deal with the kind of the root structure of the problem, and had actual political agendas and politics geared towards that end. Whether or not it would work or not, whether or not they would get defeated, whether or not they would meet it head on and whatever was going to happen, but they were actually headed towards that goal.
Being able to sit at the table of America. Malcolm X said, you can't call me a diner just because I'm sitting at the table. I'm not a diner until I'm eating what's on the table. So we're at the table and we're like, yeah, I'm American, and everybody else eating, but we not. So we're like, oh, well, maybe
Some people eating. I don't know what y'all talking about, bro. I don't know why y'all.
If our people were eating, the movement, the people who birthed this movement, hashtag ADOS, would not need it. We wouldn't. The reparations wouldn't have not become a conversation again. The only reason it became a conversation is because the smartest brains in the hashtag lineage movement arrived at the conclusion that it's impossible for Black people to stay in this country without some type of economic transformation, and that transformation cannot occur without reparations. So how are you saying you're eating? If FBA is starving, how are you eating?
Well, that part is true. Yeah, that part is true. So yeah, the movement was actually formed because everybody realizes. I mean, this wasn't the people of the movement realized. Everybody knows that Black people, insofar as that, I mean, it doesn't, not to live in America, to survive, and Black America specifically, this particular group of people we're talking about, to survive, yes, you need 100% need. You don't necessarily need reparations, but yeah, I mean, you need something like that, something in the same essence of it. So yeah, if you want, yeah, definitely reparations. Then, if that ultimately has to be the word for what you're describing. It has to be some type of program or some type of agenda driven towards allowing Black people to have a certain amount of rights in acquisition of education, property, or whatever within this particular structure. Obviously, there's the alternative of destroying the system entirely, though. So obviously, he's leaving that kind of out again. But obviously, within the context of what he was talking about specifically within the reparation discussion, then obviously their conclusion to that would be reparations as opposed to, and that's where the controlled opposition comes in again, right? Because obviously there is the other oppositional way of destroying the system and then obtaining reparations through the traditional defeat of a system.
We are eating. I'm not starving. We not starving. We need reparations to prepare the damage that they did.
What the damage is that we
out of here, bro.
The damage is that we as a collective.
Out of here, bro. He is gonna babble.
Yo, why do you keep using the term babble, bro?
Babble, well, you know what I mean. Babble. That's all we gonna make
your audio, brother George.
Let me ask the.
Okay, so that devolves, but I guess the issue with I guess the other part of it, okay, what the other guy was saying as far as we're eating, that's two different perspectives of looking at it. One from okay, there's relative, right? Okay, so relative to white people not eating, right? Relative to, I mean, just in general, as far as like literally, yes, eating. A lot of Black people are doing terrible, but they're moving along. The problem is that things are getting progressively a lot worse. So in a futuristic sense, looking at projections, staying at the bottom with barely anything to show, eventually that's going to shatter, collapse, and you're going to deal with dealt a situation where that's no longer sustainable at the bottom. As you know, inflation goes up, as maybe the value of the dollar we see affected now, so prices and everything goes up, but then your purchasing power and stuff like that goes down. Automation, lack of jobs because of automation and stuff like that. Lack of education, but then education and technology is starting to become more and more a part of people's daily lives. Lack of access to the technology could start becoming more of a factor. Obviously the wealth playing a role already in, acquisition of things, not having the money, but then not having the wealth either. Maybe not owning homes, land, property, and stuff like that, when maybe owning a home, land, property to live off of is going to start becoming a big deal. So obviously those are two different frameworks to view of it, but obviously the one is more whole looking at the situation. And this is something I wanted to show as far as nationalism historically.
Our survey also revealed that some of the best-known Negro spokesmen have
this is basically to show that I think historically Black nationalism gets blown out of proportion as far as how popular it was ever. in, the mainstream American view.
Least support. For example, Stokely Carmichael, an advocate of black power and black separatism. 8 out of 10 Negroes say that they've heard of him.
So that's 80% heard of him.
But only 6% say they approve of his ideas.
So it's 80% known, but 6% approved.
Another example, H. Rap Brown, also a black separatist. He has preached hatred of whites and urged violence as a weapon of protest. 7 out of 10 Negroes say they have
So 70% less.
heard of Brown,
10%
but only
less.
5% say they approve of his views.
Which is low.
It may be fair to conclude that black extremists and separatists have received more attention from the news media
And you have to ask why.
than their strength in the Negro community commands. The question remains, just how militant are the majority of Negroes?
Right. And you have to ask yourself why. And obviously, we know why. There was an agenda, like I mentioned, to get particular people perceived a particular way, to get them caught up legally and have the public view them a particular way. But that's definitely it for this video. Well, I was going to cover, what I was supposed to cover originally was supposed to be the Gerald Horne aspect of it, which, look, he has his views. They're not, they're probably a little bit more refined version than of what is discussed by a lot of the other stuff. Because he obviously, when asked about the Patriot type stuff, doesn't really have the opinion of like totally against it. Like I think he said pretty much he doesn't care if someone hangs the American flag as long as they're not on like any other type weird stuff.
By Professor Gerald Horne, who currently holds the Morris Professorship of History and African American Studies, author of more than 30 books, including Paul Robeson, The Artist as Revolutionary, Race to Revolution. Being embarrassed on the national stage can have some domestic political effect. Although I will say in the years following, in the moments following Trump's presidency, I do have some skepticism about how much kind of national embarrassment and shame really will motivate political actors here at home. And obviously there's kind of these kind of counter-historical.
There's a political rupture. It leads to the formation of communist parties globally. It leads to the formation of the International Labor Defense, which then, under the guise of the Scottsboro case, globalizes the struggle against Jim Crow. And not unlike the struggle against apartheid in the 1980s and 1990s, it puts enormous pressure on the United States to move away from the more egregious aspects of Jim Crow, such as, they're picketing and pelting US embassies and legations all over the world. Likewise, because of the economic collapse, that gives impetus to the organizing of the CIO, and of course, position. I'm not one of these traditional US Black nationalists. I may be a Black nationalist, but not in the way it's popularly understood in 2021.
What does that mean?
What it means is that I don't think that the fellow denizens of North America are devils, for example.
Okay.
That's not my philosophy. People want to put you in that position because then they can dismiss you and don't have to deal with everything you're saying. They can just sweep you under the rug like they sweep Native Americans under the rug. I understand that. So yes, there have been historical moments, oftentimes, once again, based upon external factors like the Bolshevik Revolution, which gives rise to the Communist Party and gives us a shot of where Ian Smith and the National Front said explicitly they were walking in the footsteps of 1776. Not unlike the settler historians, they don't even ask the question, the fundamental question, which a person from outer space would logically ask, which is that in light of Spain's first movers advantage, sponsoring Columbus in 1492, how is it that we're all in North America speaking English, particularly when it was a minor monarchy, speaking of England, on the fringes of Europe in the 1500s? A lot of it has to do with the transition from religion to race. That is to say that in Spanish Cuba, you could be a conquistador, and in other parts of so-called Spanish America, if you profess Catholicism. As Protestant.
Well, I guess as someone who's in communications, I would never put the word just in front of rhetoric. I think it needs to understand history better and that it would inform its project. but I guess I'm looking for clarity about what that would look like in practice. Understanding how we got here and applying terms.
Collaborationism in practice. I mean, for example, look, as I say in The Nation, please look at my piece in The Nation, which comes out within days. Most of these U.S. historians, they're specialists. They look at the period between 1750 and 1783, or 1850 and 1865, or 1950 and 1965, 1965 to 1970. And so it's like coming into a movie, as I say in that piece you quoted against left-wing white nationalism, they come into the movie midway through and think they understand the plot. Or alternatively, they're like the jurors in the Rodney King case in 1992, when the slide defense lawyers don't play the tape of Rodney King being beaten from loop to loop, from beginning to end. They show snippets, and then the community and black and white unite and fight. And not even realizing the history of slavery and how so many Euro-Americans were co-opted to support slavery. I mean, that's the whole history of the Confederate States of America. So some of these Dixie analysts, they say, well, most of those who fought for the Confederacy, they weren't slave owners. Well, of course not. That's the essence of class collaboration, for example. They thought that they could become slave owners. Just like I think it's fair to say that there is a revolt in 2021 against the devaluation of the currency of whiteness, which was pressed from below by Black people and their allies in the post-1945 dispensation, which you articulated, and then pressed from above by the international community, which then reaches, of course, the US Supreme Court and eventually the White House.
So realizing history and understanding history with the depth that you do, I'm curious if you were in a position of political power or were the leader of one of these movements, what would you do differently? If you were, let's say, a figurehead during the protests of last summer, which I believe had a lot of political potential that did, people need to understand the project of going to college is like an either two version of Black is kids don't really this is saying other literature.
Well, as we wind down, let me repeat that I'm not going to argue with anybody about patriotism. I mean, I have my position, they have their position. That's true for many different stances. So if they want to wave the flag and construct Crispus Attucks as the first Black patriot, go for it. But you also may want to get a deeper understanding of history, because ultimately that will lead you to a better place, I assure you. As long as we can unite on the 3.5 trillion, as long as we can unite on infrastructure, free college education, and with regard to that latter point, I think it's too simple to say that neither party does this or that, when it's the political dynamics that determine what either party does. If you have a substantial percentage of Euro-American workers who are voting for the Republicans, and you're not a Republican and you're seeking office, well, you're gonna have to pay attention to that. It's just like complaining about Joe Manchin without recognizing that Trump won West Virginia by about 30 or 40 points. I mean,
and Bernie Sanders won every district in West Virginia.
That was a primary. I'm talking about
primary.
The Democrats, Republicans, and independents voting.
Well, of course, we never got to Bernie in the general election because the Democratic Party.
So we're talking about something fictional then.
Well,
we didn't get to Bernie in the general election.
I think it matters that the Democratic Party in both instances chose, right? They chose the possibility
of Bernie
Donald Trump.
won Michigan and then Trump won Michigan. I mean,
well,
look,
no, if I could just
you have to give some agency. You can't talk about agency. And then when it comes to Euro-Americans, agency flies out the window. They're dupes. They have no agency. Well, they're disappointed with the
Okay, this is the point where you watch this.
Democratic Party, which then turns Black people into dupes.
This is true. Black people are dupes, and you could get an argument. This is a legitimate argument. Well, I mean, this is kind of like legitimate, but in a sense, you could say, well, who is actually dumber? Or the white people who vote for, which a lot of them aren't poor, which I mean, I discussed that in other, but, or the people who were considering these poor white people or whatever, who vote for Republican in whatever numbers, are they the idiots? Or are Black people who voted for Democrats in absolutely overwhelming numbers the bigger idiots? That's a legit question. So his argument in this instance has to be that, well, the white people obviously who are voting for the Republicans are doing it out of this, racial self-interest or whatever. They think that they're going to get something, from the racism or whatever in return or whatever, or they're or just they're doing it for the racism just in general, and screw getting anything in return. That's not their main concern. And then because obviously if you accept the opposite, where they're stupid and voting against their self-interest, then maybe your black people voting stupidly against their self-interest, as well for voting for Democrats. If you accept the view that the Democrats are given an equal amount of nothing, like just junk, white supremacy or whatever. But the case is that, yeah, I mean, I don't think that I would view it a little bit differently. So the groups of people who are voting for Republican probably, I mean, can be argued are voting against their interests insofar as they're voting for Republicans generally, because they're just voting for an establishment. So in that sense, the people who are voting for Trump who claim to be voting against the establishment or differently are being duped. And in the same sense, the black people who are voting for Democrats and just in any context are being duped, because the Democratic Party is a white supremacist party, period. If you're voting and you're black and you're voting for white supremacy, period, you're a dupe. If you're voting for the Republican Party, it's the same story, but there's reasons to vote for the Republican Party in a sense, because of maybe taxes or something like that. That's like a very practical thing. Like if you're a black person who makes a particular amount of money, and Republicans are promising to give you lower tax rates, and it's just going to save you money out of like an immediate self-interest type thing, that would be better off. I mean, if you're looking at particular type of religious freedoms and you're religious and you're black or conservative, like a lot of the people in a lot of these areas are, and they're saying that they're for this conservative type stuff that you're particularly for, and those are the only type of things that they get passed. Like if the only thing that can ever get passed is like restrictive abortion bills and or pro-gun bills, and they're passing these bills while the Democrats saying they're going to open the door for these abortion type things or these LGBT type things and stuff that you're against, but the Republicans are actually blocking it. The marriage type stuff, it doesn't matter what it is. This have wedge issue type stuff that the Republicans are actually delivering on these issues, taxes or whatever else. The Republicans are delivering on these issues. So if the Republicans are delivering on these issues for you, lower taxes and everything, guns or whatever else, you have something to point to. I mean, what do black people have to point to as far as voting for Democrats? I don't know. So yeah, I mean, the real dupes are in this situation are arguably black people. So I mean, as far as that goes,
because we're voting for the Democratic Party, so we must be the ones that have no vision. This
yes.
is the kind of
but then the case is no, we're not voting for Democrats. Like black people aren't voting for Democrats. In general, the same way that poor white people aren't voting for Republicans in a sense. Poor people again just don't vote. So out of the people who do vote, especially like the middle class, like the bourgeois, the bougie, black people are a bourgeois, adjacent or assimilating or college educated black people. Yeah, they might vote for Democrats. But like, people like around the way, like if they vote for Democrats, it's not even like. It could be just like they're maybe like voting for Obama just because he's black type stuff, or like voting Democrat just because you're supposed to, but not really paying any attention to the politics of it, or just voting for the lesser of two evils in a sense. Sometimes, like you just feel this guy is better than the other guy, but not even paying attention to really the politics of it. I mean, any type of genuinely engaged person, I feel. Or even somebody who's just a kind of general, you're either going to be kind of apathetic to politics and not vote at all, or you're just not going to vote for any of the major parties. Maybe vote Green Party, vote other people down ballot or something like that. I mean, that's pretty much what it has come to. The big numbers on Democrats a lot probably comes from fraud in the middle class.
Cuckoo world that sort of thinking leads to. Which is one of the reasons, once again, we may be on the verge of fascism, and the left wing in this country is so weak because of a failure to understand history, a failure to do a critique of whiteness and white supremacy.
Okay, that's partly true, but partly false because, okay. Well, there was a critique and a view of white supremacy that's wrong and it's incorrect that comes out of certain 1319 projects. Even you could argue his work that creates bigger issues than what it is. If you got into like the correct history, you got into like a legitimate nuanced critique of it, and explanation, and people actually were receptive to it. That, I mean, I guess if people, by definition would work if they were receptive to it. But then obviously when you create this fake anti-racism stuff, when you create these like kind of like skewed narratives of this just like kind of like not very nuanced and kind of like not making very much sense in terms of what you're saying about like the 1776 type stuff, 1619 type stuff, then you're going to create more issues and you're going to create more backlash. You're going to create more like hunkering down into like those conservative points. The fascism stuff I addressed in the other video as far as like this, because he has the same view that so Adolf Reed had in another video as far as the fascism, which I already explained that, so I'm not going to re-explain that part about the fascism, which is sort of ridiculous. I mean, the black people voting Democrats is voting for fascism more than anybody voting for Trump.
Particularly about your Euro-American friends who should be in the vanguard. As a matter of fact, they should have been for the longest, black people did not have access to historical archives. They did. And yet they were constructing all these fantasies about 1776 as this grand Democratic Republican experiment. They're the ones who even swept Texas under the rug, even though their predecessors, including John Quincy Adams, warned that letting Texas into the Union would wreck the United States of America. His ideological descendants today don't even take that position. No wonder we're in trouble.
Well, to your point about agency, what I was saying about Democrats and their reconciliation bill is this. If it does not pass, right? We have Manchin and Sinema, even in the last couple of days, Manchin coming forward and saying that he has a problem with the $3.5 trillion price tag. There's all this kabuki theater that goes around. Joe Biden coming out saying the parliamentarian means that we can't do meaningful immigration reform at the same time that we have these Django Unchained images happening at the border where Haitians are being rounded up by white men on horseback, or I don't know the race of the men on horseback, but they seem to not be blackly plucked out.
Interrogated on CNN late edition just a few days ago. And they were asking him about Joe Manchin and Sinema. He said, what about these Republicans? They're not going to give one vote. And I agree with Bernie Sanders. And what about the base of the Republican Party, which fails to penalize their elected representatives for voting against their objective interests? And what about the US left, which finds it much more convenient to speak of Democrats in broad terms and have this false equivalence between both sides? The Republicans are bad, the Democrats are bad.
That's just wrong too. Yeah, they're just bad. Both just bad. One's a party of white supremacy, the other's party of capitalism. They're both bad.
Which then, it reminds me of contemporary arguments about China, which we should have been talking about. That's one of my favorite issues, where you have our friends on the left, as opposed to focusing like a laser beam on US imperialism, they're quite willing to be distracted by enlisting in the new Cold War against China, for example. In other words,
that's true.
More this both sidesism, as opposed to focusing like a laser beam on the folks who are the real obstructionists, which I think might give you more purchase and more momentum going forward.
All right. Well, I appreciate.
Well, yeah, okay, that kind of drifted off a little bit, but I did want to address some of the points of Jared Horn, which I think originally I was going to get into this stuff about this 1776 stuff because that was relevant, but I mean I think that's what it changed. So I think I addressed the points of the nationalism well enough for that, but yeah, I think I addressed it well enough for that. But I mean, I guess what I could say is, I guess in closing, the 1770 like six narrative gets skewed through the same type of like lens basically of a nationalist framework of like just like ignoring like the nuance type like issues like I already mentioned with what was going on in terms of I guess you could say like the difference between like Du Bois's Black Reconstruction or something like ignoring some of the nuanced things going on with like the ambivalence of like the slavery issue, like it just being like simple, and it obviously wasn't. But I mean, in certain instances, he was Gerald Horne is obviously correct, but in certain instances, he could kind of deviate, and then that creates uh ways where the controlled opposition could come in, because you could have people who are opposing him on this side, but then they favor this more scientific socialist nonsense that becomes more racist. And then you could have people like, on the other side who favor this that becomes more nationalist and racial sensualist. And then you kind of miss like again, you miss the real opposition. But yeah, that's coming up on 2 hours. I mean, that's it for the video. This is done. This series is done. I'm hoping it was okay. At least I know this last video was not maybe as on par with what I wanted, but I had to get something done just to get something done for this, and it finish this off. That's probably going to be it, because the summertime I get like busy with other stuff, working and stuff like that. Can't keep up with this type of stuff, but I might be doing stuff on the website maybe. So yeah, I'll edit this video and get it up, and it'll obviously be up maybe a little bit after I'm recording it. So probably it'll be maybe the end of the week or something, and this video will be up.